Hello there. Welcome back to the First Stage Woodworking Podcast. My name is Paul Hyatt and I'll be your host. We talk about craftsmanship and finding meaning in our lives. I hope that you enjoy this podcast and that you will like, subscribe, and share it along with other people who might be interested in stuff like this. Thank you and God bless. Alrighty. Welcome back to the First Stage Woodworking Podcast. It's been a little bit since I've had a guest on. And I just happen to have a really, really great individual fall into my lap based off of a book club that I was involved in for about 6 months now, I would say. I was
Mm,
invited
yeah,
into a Lord of the Rings book club by Kevin O'Brien. And my guest today, David Treadway, is a mutual friend of Kevin, who I was fortunate to be able to meet through Homeschool Connections. And by that, I was blessed to be able to meet David. And I was always very blown away by his insights on Lord of the Rings as we were reading through that together. And just an incredibly philosophicically gifted, theologically gifted guy to talk to. So I reached out to him and asked him if he would want to come on to the podcast. But David, I believe you're involved in banking, and you also are a actor. And
mhm.
so I just want you to introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, of course, man. Thank you so much for having me on the show. This is pretty awesome. Yeah, banking as the 9 to 5 gig and acting. So definitely banker, actor in that order. Um, I have over the past, so I'm almost 44 now, and since I was about 16, 15, 16, I have been involved in various types of theater, film, writing, acting, producing, directing. So I've been really, really fortunate to do kind of all of it, really, when it comes down to it. Really, really got into acting when, at about the age of 15, I had been playing competitive sports for most of my younger life, and I was actually fairly good. I played baseball. Even me and a few guys on the team that I was on, we even got scouted, and
What
yeah, it
position
was
did you
fun.
play?
I'm a southpaw, so first base was my yeah first base, and then I never hit for a lot of power, so typically, and I wasn't super fast, so usually in the lineup you're going to find me batting sixth or seventh, but scrappy, I guess. So, but I've been playing competitive sports and just through a series of events got burned out on it, and right at that time, my parents had enrolled my sister at a dance studio that was a part of a church that we were going to then. And about a year after she began doing dance there, I joined a program where they taught movement and pantomime. And it was kind of a thing where initially I joined just because I wanted to be, I wanted to know people in the church and just different things like that. But what was amazing was God used it to move me into the thing that He made me for, and that was to express stories and specifically express stories that point people to Him. Um, and so I began the pantomime training. It sounds kind of weird, I know, but began the pantomime training, and that led to me then eventually also doing disciplines of dance, voice, music theory, and I had already been doing some of those sorts of disciplines because my dad's a musician, and he traveled professionally when he was younger. So art has always been in my family, and my sister now owns her own dance school, and she's been doing that now for over 10 years. And then I have had the opportunity with various theater companies as well as my own production companies to make everything from digital commercial content to touring with faith-based repertory companies and doing things like that. So but it's amazing what happens when God moves you into the space where you start operating in the thing you're made for. It opens you up. There's a line from, and because I'm a massive movie buff, one of my favorite movies, though most people say it's just long and drawn out, is Chariots of Fire. And one of the reasons I love Chariots of Fire so much is because it chronicles this. He's a Protestant missionary actually named Eric Liddell, and it chronicles his journey from recognizing this gift he has as a runner to trying out for the Olympic Games to getting accepted for the Olympics. But he has this line in the movie which is so great, and he says, "When I run, I can feel God's pleasure." And I think that is the epitome of what it is to operate in the thing that you're made for. It isn't that you're feeling your own it's not self gratification. You actually feel that joy of the Lord. And when you feel that, when you're operating in that, you know that you're moving in the thing for which God has created you. So when I began doing those things, when I began doing more writing and just different things like that, and the acting, it was like this well of joy in me. And there's nothing quite like it. So I've been doing that now, yes, like I said, since I was 16. So, I mean, we're talking well over 20 years. And yeah, I love it.
Okay. Um, I mean, there's a lot there that I would like
There is.
to ask you about. Uh, I guess you threw a term out there that I'm relatively unfamiliar with. What do you mean by pantomime? Is that just
Right.
another term for acting, or
Exactly. So pantomime is traditionally a silent art form where all stories are told through movement of the body. But unlike dance, in pantomime, what you're doing is you're actually moving in such a way so that it appears that objects, and everybody's going to know this, such as a wall or a rope or something like that, you're manifesting the reality of that thing by using movement and specifically movement in counterpoint, meaning that you're creating weight and resistance for something that's not actually there. And so that if I am attempting to walk against the wind, which is something you see pantomimes do all the time,
yeah,
what they're doing is the position of their body and the discipline of how they've trained their muscles makes it appear as though there's something resisting them when there isn't. Pantomime is also typically done in whiteface. So the face completely done with white makeup. And then all pantomimes have what is called the circle of silence. The black line that goes around the outer face that outlines the white, that's called the circle of silence. The circle of silence is sort of a symbolic way of saying that the communication that I am participating in right now is all done through my physical movement. There are a couple different schools of pantomime. There's the Polish school, and then there's the French school. Most people are familiar, who are at all familiar with pantomime, are familiar with Marcel Marceau. He's sort of the godfather of French pantomime. And French pantomime is known to be much more lyrical, much more airy, while Polish pantomime is known to be much more what is referred to as in the floor, connected to the earth, where you see a lot more of the movements. It's almost like thinking the difference between dwarves and elves. That's kind of how you can think of it. Polish pantomime is dwarves, and French pantomime is elves.
okay.
So
So,
yeah.
so, but I'm assuming, like, I've just like people around here. I don't like. I've never heard it referred to as pantomime before. I've just always heard to as being a mime or seeing a mime in action, and that. So, am I right that that's essentially what you're describing?
Correct. That's the exact same thing. When everyone
Just
hears,
wanted to
"Oh,
make
they're a
sure,
mime,"
right. I was
no,
like,
right. You want to get the definitions correct. Yeah.
right, yeah, yeah. Just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I didn't want to. I was like, man, if I don't know exactly what he's talking about, then and I'm never scared to not to be that person that admits like I don't know what that just meant. But yeah, that's a lot more clear to me now. There's another thing you said there that I really really liked, and we had talked about this, and well, I mean, we basically just talked for like 6 months about this.
We did, yeah.
Was essentially the importance of stories. And you said that
Yes,
you are, um, that's kind of what I picked up when you were talking about your background, is that you feel like it's your calling in life to essentially tell stories that hopefully unite people with like the highest possible good, or to get them to
that's
be
exactly right.
to see God in this form of art that you have done. Now, um, I want to talk about the importance of those stories, but I wanted to ask you, so did you just immediately, like, were you immediately interested in telling stories that pertain to that, or was that what your career kind of developed into as an actor, or like, were you always interested in acting out? like a theological drama or like a theodrama, or were you just kind of drawn to acting, and then through the years you kind of discovered that higher purpose and meaning out of it?
That's a really great question. And the development of it, I think, is interesting. Ever since I was a small kid, and as most kids do, you participate in various types of school plays and things like that. But ever since I was a little kid, I have had a sense of the transcendent. It's just been something that's just been present. And obviously, I wasn't able to articulate it that way as a child. But there was just something about the world that I always thought this is bigger than it looks in a way. And so stories always fascinated me, and I didn't have words for it at the time, but I just sort of knew it. And what happened was when I got a little bit older, because as a kid, like I said, my dad traveled as a professional musician and things like that. So I was exposed to to performance and art. I started playing music from a young age. So did my sister. So those things were always there, but that sort of that melding of the of being able to articulate the higher purpose and then how stories could do that, that didn't actually really happen until I was probably about 15 or 16, about the same time that I joined the church I'd mentioned earlier, where I saw that passion that I had for storytelling, and in a way it had gotten lost for a while because I was involved, as I said, with the competitive sports. So that really, I just became crazy involved in that. I traveled for it and all that and all those things. But when I started to get interested in kind of fitting in, which is the reason I started these classes to learn this discipline in the first place. Um, Initially, it was just that. It's like I wanted to fit in. There were kids I enjoyed hanging around, and so we did this stuff together. But then the more I saw that the ability, there was something again that spoke back to that transcendent aspect of the world is bigger than it looks. And I could sense it when I did it. That was the thing. When I performed, and I performed these particular stories, or I performed these particular sets of principles and values, that those are the things infused into the stories we were telling. I sensed it. I felt it. It was, and this is something we'll have to talk about. It was incarnational. And I think that is the pivot point. Our friend, you mentioned him at the beginning of your introduction, Kevin O'Brien, who invited both of us to the book club we were in. I remember the first time I had a conversation about acting being incarnational was actually with Kevin. He and I were on a plane together, and I think we were coming back from Maryland. We had done a performance of some selected scenes from Shakespeare, Shakespearean plays. I think we were doing Hamlet. And we were talking about this sense of an emptying of oneself to take on a character, how essentially you start to wear this character a little bit, or the character wears you. You kind of, there's an incarnational aspect to acting where you are filling potential, but it's not alive until you are placed into it. And I think that's the thing I began experiencing was we were filling something. God was using us in this capacity of telling a story through putting on a character. We were bringing something to life. Something was becoming animate because uh, God moved us to embody something. And that's the point at which it began to be where you were asking earlier about when did that sense of telling these stories with a greater purpose and pointing toward the greatest good, when did that begin? It was at that point. It was at that point where I recognized that the stories could be vessels for not just a message, because one of my professors in college, he was such a great guy, a theater professor named Ken Lee. He said that one of the things that he felt Christian art struggled with the most was the balance between message and medium. And he said there has to be a balance so that the art is worthy of the message. And if all you're interested in is simply just getting a message out there, he said, then the art doesn't matter in the first place. But if you really are truly interested in telling a story, and the way in which you're going to tell that story, the medium you're going to use for it is worthy of the message that you're communicating, then the art has to be worthy of the message. There has to be a balance between message and medium. And so that was the point at which I think I recognized that there is something so much greater in the stories that we have the opportunity to tell that are moving toward pointing people toward the greatest good, that the development of your art can't be something that is an afterthought. It has to be just as important in terms of preparation as the importance of the message. And so I had a dual path. There was that aspect of it with the acting and the performing, but then there was the other aspect of it where I had a gift for just doing those things to make money too. So I've worked for local production studios here in St. Louis, where I live, doing digital production for them. I was the director of a digital content department for a few years. I've done freelance work where I've traveled to various places in the U.S., Louisiana, California, New York, New Jersey, and shot and recorded and edited things for commercial and for industrial purposes. So there are two sides to that, and yes, you can certainly, the one side is just practical, and but you still employ all of those skills that you're developing. But the other side, you recognize that the message you're communicating, there's a higher calling in it. And so the art that you're creating in order to be a vessel for that message, that art has to have the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in it in order to do what it's meant to do. And again, in that way, there's an incarnational aspect to it. There is something being made animate that before was simply just potential, or in a sense even was not alive at all.
Yeah, and I like listening to you talk about all of that. It sounds so like for me, I had something kind of interesting or something similar to that kind of take place as an educator. Is that
Okay.
like when you're a school teacher, you I mean, you don't start out like this. So I mean, it's kind of like I'm assuming how acting went the first time that like the
Right.
first time that you tried to do something, like you were like, well, I'm gonna, try, but the craft kind of teaches you, like how you are going to do this dance basically. So like those first couple of years that I was a school teacher, like I didn't I didn't know, like enough really about myself maybe, but I went into it with a very open mind about, and I kind of like looked at the situation of like, well, I'm going to attempt to, um, at the very least, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be a loving teacher. And I don't mean that in the sense of like, come here and I'll make everything okay, but I'm going to will for your better. So like I'm
Wow,
going to be that person that's in your corner. That if I see that you have more, then I'm going to push you, and and to make sure that I'm essentially being the win in your sales and whatnot. Um, but then like over time, what I discovered is that that really imparted itself on me. Like that
yeah.
that really it became like a glove that had to be worn basically,
Yeah.
and that like when I walk in front of those students, it's like there's nothing like it. It is very much like your calling that you're like I have to go and do this, and then I stepped away from teaching for about a year and a half there, um, and it was like the hardest thing I ever done. It was torture to not be able to continue to do that thing, because it is that spirit that that moves through you, that it's that that joy that you have when
Yeah.
you're in front of these kids, that and you can feel it, like you can feel like the hair stand up on the back of your neck, you can feel your heart rate elevate when you know that you have like you and all I was ever really doing as a teacher was just teaching the truth. But I might put that, say, for example, in a story. And
Right.
then like when I like had that sense of like the supreme joy. It's like when
Hmm.
I felt that, I would like look at it was like I was, like kind of like the students kind of like fell away, and then I would like look up, and then I would have all of the students' eyes looking at me. And then and it was one of those things that's like, oh, I tapped into something there. Like that's like
Hmm.
a very much a heaven meeting earth type of experience in
Absolutely.
so kind of the way that you're describing acting, it is very very similar to all of that. But I also did notice too that, that as a teacher that, if you really really want to convey a message, especially as a history teacher, most kids go into a history class already with their mind up made up that they're going to hate it, and it's because they have a bad taste in their mouth because they're like, "Oh, I'm just going to learn a bunch of names and dates, and that's all there
Right.
is to it." But I would look at my classes, especially toward the end of the time that I was an educator at public school, when I taught world history. I would tell them on day one, I was like, "I'm going to tell you a story from start to finish." And you're not going to see necessarily where it's all going until the very end of the course. I was like, but it's going to make sense from start to finish, and it's going to be a really really exciting story. And then the whole course was just a bunch of stories, and students really really appreciated that because they were like, it's like the history is alive. It's
Mm.
not just something that's dead and in the past. It's something that's still very much alive today that you're breathing new life into. uh,
Mhm.
so and I kind of knew that from listening to the things I learned from Jordan Peterson and some of the other thinkers that I listened to out there that had just talked about, the importance of stories, and how like we really don't think it, like it's very hard to think like a scientist, for example. My wife is a scientist, and I don't know how, it's like, that's like a job to me. It's like, that's, like entirely too much to be able to take on. I greatly respect it, but at the same time, it's just like, I don't have that level of interest in stuff like that. I think that it's because, like, I think that's why we developed the more modern scientific method much later in the written record, is because stories just come so natural to humans. And
Right.
so I mean, like, as an actor, as a person that's trying um, to tell great stories, and especially with what you do with Kevin, it's is it theater of the word?
Theater of the Word Incorporated. Yeah.
Yeah. You guys, are trying to tell, like the greatest stories, so by their definition, like these stories don't get any better than what
It's
than
true.
what they do. So yeah, I and that's why I wanted to have you on this podcast, because uh, I love to watch stories. I love the drama of seeing that all acted out. And a great actor can really make for a great performance, and also, and a great staff that's directing and producing it.
Mhm.
That when they have everything all come together, then you can really wind up with something truly truly amazing that really really elevates the human spirit. um, but if you don't have that, then you have, a lot of garbage and hogwash that really no one should want to go buy a movie to see, but unfortunately people do. So
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
so I enjoy essentially, the aspect of consuming these things, but actually embodying those stories is something very foreign to me because I have zero acting talent whatsoever. So, um, but I did want to ask you also, before we kind of get into to talking about the craftsmanship of being an actor. Um, you are Catholic,
I am.
and uh, you you are a convert in much the same way that I am, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So I'm assuming that we probably have similar backgrounds there, but I'm assuming that acting probably had an impact on that. Did it,
In
or?
Yes.
Okay. What,
Yeah.
if you don't mind me, without, I mean, I know when you start asking people about their,
Conversion is, yeah, it's always a big, big
just to
story.
say the wrong thing, yeah. But what was it about acting that that kind of led to this conversion?
Well, what's kind of amazing is, and I think maybe it's just going to become a theme as we continue to talk. Kevin O'Brien's going to be a theme. Um, when there was a certain point, I had been attempting to do a lot of professional acting in St. Louis, and it wasn't going great in terms of being able to have consistent enough work, and then also support yourself and things like that. And I had thought for quite some time about moving out to New York. And at the time I was married, and my ex-wife had a really really good job in St. Louis, and we had talked about it, and there was the sense that it was like, okay, if we're going to make this leap, let's really think about it and think about how to do it. And so we got a lot of plans together, and really we were seriously considering doing it. And then finally one day, she just said, "You know what? It doesn't make sense. It's not practical. I have this business here. Our families are here, etc." And truthfully, I tend to be the dreamer, and I tend to be the leap before you look type. So, but when I stopped and thought about it, it was really true. I thought, it doesn't make sense. It's not a this is we're not in a place right now where I have enough relationship built out there to say, okay, we could go out there, and at the very least I could take these relationships that I have and continue to build on them. And so I said to her, I said, what if um, we make an agreement? If we're not going to move, then what if we do this? If I can audition for things, even if it requires me to travel, we'll just agree that we'll deal with that, with me not being home sometimes. And she agreed happily to that because it meant we could stay. So that same week, I started perusing just every audition I could find for any kind of theater in St. Louis that was at all consistent, and then places, also near and around in different states. And the first audition we used to have an audition board in St. Louis called STL Auditions, and the first the first audition I came across said, faith-based theater company seeks actor for traveling repertory theater. And I was like, this is amazing. And at the time, I was also having a crisis of faith at the time, because being Protestant at that point, I had gotten to the limits of what Protestantism could offer me. Going back to that statement I made earlier about this sense ever since I was a kid that the world was bigger than it looked. I kept wondering where the rest of it was in Protestantism. That was just really the case for me. And I kept going, I know there's more than this. It's not that Jesus isn't enough. I just think Jesus gave us more than this. And so I didn't know this at the time, but when I went to audition for Kevin's company, I didn't know he was Catholic. I didn't know he was a convert, just like you and me. And so I went to audition for him. Audition went really well. He and I hit it off. And I started traveling with his company about 3 weeks later. So we had the actors that were traveling at that time with him, we were all local. And so for the next 3 weeks after I got cast in the shows, it was him and me, one other guy, and then a very good friend of mine who is also really instrumental in my coming into the church. Her name is Maria Romine. By the way, she has her own company, Swords and Roses. She's a female pirate. She's awesome. Um, and
She's a
no,
female pirate, eh?
yeah, she's a female pirate. She does these awesome all girl power pirate swashbuckling shows. They do real sword fights. It's super cool. Anyway, Swords and Roses, know it.
I'm
So
definitely intrigued by that.
it's awesome. It's so cool.
Send me a link to all of this
I'm
stuff, and
gonna have to
I
do
will
that.
definitely point everybody in the right direction. I mean,
That's exactly. You meet the coolest people when you travel as an
no
actor.
kidding, right?
You do. It's true. But so we all start traveling together, and it's me and another guy who was Protestant. Maria had just actually converted not that long ago from Protestantism to Catholicism, and then Kevin had several years earlier. Well, so here we go. We drive across the country. We're performing all over the place, and we've got these, I mean, 6, 8, 9, 12 hour drives in between shows, and we're performing almost every night somewhere different. And all this time, we're sitting there in the van having these phenomenal discussions about faith. I mean, just And like I said, I was going through a crisis of faith at the time. I hadn't been attending church, and I was still reading my Bible, and I was still exploring things. But there was just this real sense of stagnation. And we start having these conversations, and I start asking questions, and I start asking questions about the unity of the body, and I start asking questions about what's like the purpose of suffering, and just all these different things. And suddenly I'm finding that Kevin and Maria, through their own conversion experiences, had asked a lot of these same questions. And the thing that broke for me, and this was in tandem with all these conversations we were having. I remember one night I couldn't sleep, and I was at home at this point, and I got up and I just started reading scriptures. And I was reading, and I read the passage where St. Paul says, "One follows Apollos, one follows Paul, one follows Peter. Is the body of Christ divided?" And I was looking at my experience within Protestantism, going, "Why in the world do we have so many denominations? We all claim to believe the same thing." And that was sort of where the rock split open for me. And it was like, why are all these pieces laying here? We're supposed to be one body. And the other thing was, none of those denominations, whether it was Baptists or Methodists or Anglicans or whoever it was, none of those denominations ever said, okay, you're going to think this is crazy, but we are the Church of Jesus Christ. And the crazy thing was, through these discussions that we were having, and while we were performing, because all the shows that we were performing while we were traveling, they were all shows either about the lives of the saints or about the life of the church, the Catholic Church. And so I'm not only learning through the scripts that I'm memorizing, I'm also having these amazing conversations. And suddenly, here was a church that claimed, no, from the time of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, this is the church. It claimed that there is a purpose for suffering, which can be united to the cross and be redemptive. That there is a vicar of Christ. God's representative on earth is the Pope, and it is the way since the Old Testament, really, if you look at it, that God has always placed someone at the forefront of the body in order to help lead it. And all of these questions begin to get answered. And I within a very short period of time, I was convinced. Now, I wasn't convinced at the point where I was just ready to go ahead and sign up for RCIA and do the whole thing.
Right.
I was convinced at the point where I said, these are the answers I'm looking for, but I need to be diligent in my pursuit of this and not allow it to be something where it's just like, okay, I feel the relief of all this pressure now, but really to believe it, not to have an intellectual assent only, but to truly have the mark of a converted faith in it. And again, that continued as I traveled with Theater of the Word. And so God directly used acting to bring me from the place where I was at in Him, which was not a bad place. There is no animosity, there is no bitterness, there is no dislike for my Protestant brothers and sisters. I love my Protestant brothers and sisters. My mom and dad are still Protestant. I have good friends that are Protestant. I love all of my Protestant brothers and sisters, but I know now that in God's grace and moving me into the Catholic Church, I'm participating in the fullness of what He means for us as His body on earth. And God used acting directly to bring me into that.
That's amazing.
I agree.
And I mean, I don't know what else to say other than that. But I could imagine. I've had through my life, I've had the opportunity to have so many great conversations about faith with people like he's since passed, but I was my martial arts instructor, Larry Bennett, with my wife, with my brother, with my mother, with a lot of my friends. I just had, you heard me talking with my, friend Josh Johnson and our.
That's right. What a great video.
Oh, he's great. Which I'm actually getting ready to go see him in a few weeks. So that's
awesome, man. That's
yeah,
so cool.
We're really excited, but uh, but the key there though is just is the logos, just allowing the word to move, which is I'm assuming why you guys chose the name Theater of the Word is to right. But
you got it.
I mean it's it's just a very, very beautiful story. How old were you, if you don't mind me asking, when you kind of arrived at all this?
So this would have been, I came into the church in 2014,
Okay.
and I was 35, but the journey began in 2009. So it was
Okay.
5 years before that. So I was about 30 when this all began. And then over the course of 5 years, for various reasons, that it took that amount of time. And I know for some people it takes less, and for some people it takes more. But yeah, so over the course of about 5 years, through study, through and my conversion, and this is not a me trying to say, oh, look how brave and noble I am, and pat me on the back and I suffered so much. But my conversion was a real time of suffering. And it, as much joy and consolation as there was also a great deal of desolation in it. And so, and to be honest with you, I'm glad for that. Um, it's necessary for us to suffer in order to grow. And really, even if you tie this back into acting, it's a really great thing. When you are embodying a character that is going through an immense amount of suffering, as an actor, you're taught mentally, psychologically, and emotionally how to make sure that you don't allow yourself to actually end up in the space where the character is, regardless of the character's attitudes and emotions, whether that's joy and gladness, or whether that's sorrow and desolation. Um, you have methods and you have tools to make sure that you're embodying a character, but you're not actually becoming the character in terms of those experiences being your experiences. And sometimes you do have to go pretty far in order to do it convincingly, but it's no longer acting when it crosses the line from I am portraying something to I am actually within this experience. And so um, the suffering that was a part of my conversion was necessary in order for the faith that developed in me to be a solid faith, in order for it to be a faith that was, as our Lord talks about, the various types of seed that were scattered upon the various types of ground, so that it wasn't a faith that was on the rocky soil that quickly got choked out, so that it wasn't a faith that where the roots didn't grow deep, or where thorns came up and the brambles choked it, but a faith that really was going to grow. And the suffering was necessary for that. And the beautiful part of that is, again, that is another experience that for an actor, it provides you something to draw from when you are portraying a character who is experiencing something like that. You can incorporate those memories into a performance, or those experiences into a performance, because you have the ability to be objective about them after they have passed. And it helps. Well, that's just one of those ways in which you can make sure that you're staying separate from the character in terms of your emotional and psychological state. But again, there's this through line where God uses the idea of incarnation and the understanding of filling something in order to animate it, that runs throughout not only my conversion but also the opportunities I've had to act.
Yeah, and what you were saying about suffering is just a very, very beautiful thing. I mean, like, in so I'm where you were, roughly about 10 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like I started, um, really going through my process of conversion in my late 20s. I, but I fully came into the church when I was 32, and it's just been one thing after the other since, like, I mean, it's definitely been a rocky road since that point.
Mm,
That's the thing, that's suffering is, when it's united to the cross, it's a beautiful thing,
that's
and
right.
it's where you find the real meaning. That's why, that's why nothing can overcome Christ and Christianity and our faith, is because it is based off of this idea of suffering and self-sacrifice for the greater good. And it's
That's
actually
exactly right.
moments of profound suffering and silence, and where you're unsure of things, that you find that you're not alone,
That's
and
right.
and that you feel that thing that we were talking about. You feel that spirit that comes back on you and breathes new life into you and dusts you off and tells you, oh, yes, you, if you were relying on your own uh, level of wisdom, which isn't too terribly much,
No, it's not.
uh, if you were to, you would screw this up way more. But if you fear God, then you'll have that wisdom. And
That's right.
so, yeah, definitely, definitely beautiful stuff. But we could talk about that
Oh
all.
my gosh, yeah, right.
But uh,
Absolutely. We'll do that in
I
part
did
two.
want to ask you though about so to just give you an analogy of maybe what can maybe guide this discussion,
Yeah.
like um, so so I'm a teacher and I'm also a woodworker. You know, like I made this right here, and I make all kinds of other goofy stuff. And I'm getting ready to start a business making pipes and all kinds of crazy things. So I mean,
Which are awesome, by the way. I've seen those pipes, and
yeah, I
I'm gonna have to get me an order for them at some point.
well, and that's so like that's kind of the thing that I've been thinking for years. You know, I've put quite a bit of skin in the game when it comes to being a woodworker, and I mean, I have a lot of tools now, and I have good tools. Like they're not, and I have paid dearly for them, and they mean a lot to me. But uh, uh, but like so as a craftsman, or no, I remember what I was going to say real quick there. It's funny that I was always kind of like looking for that product that it's like, what's kind of that balance between something that's more of a craft, but I could also make it, and it would be something that people would actually buy because I mean, I mean, there's the stuff that I have in my head that I want to build.
That's the age-old question, right?
Right, and so I was like, well, and I didn't start making those pipes with any intention of selling them at all. I just making them for a couple of friends that I made, and so I just happened to post them online, and then I made that little video about them and whatnot. And I've had like over the course of the past couple of weeks, I've had like 20 or 30 people reach out to me that are like, "Hey, are you going to sell those pipes? Because I'm really so." I was like, well, I guess maybe that was the sign that I was
I
looking
say, you want a
for.
sign? That's a sign, man.
Yeah, that's a pretty good sign. But as a craftsman and as a teacher, there's some tricks to the trade, right? Like
Hmm.
and there's kind of like those foundational things that you have to do, um,
Hmm.
and you get really really good at those things, and then they
Right.
kind of carry you through uh, the act that you need to get done in order to be able to have things come together. So
Yeah.
students are, they come into the class very very unwise, very very need of guidance, and hopefully they're going to leave ever so slightly wiser. Like
There
that's the
that's right.
it starts out as a pile of boards that are all kinds of wonky and need dimension. They need they need form brought onto them basically.
Yes, that's
There's
right.
a lot of tricks that you learn painfully years in order to actually get good at one's craft. So with that kind of being the I guess the guiding light here of like what is the craft of acting, and what are the things that you would say make for good acting versus not so great acting and things along those lines.
Oh, yeah, that's good, man.
That's
Um,
totally probably I can see the look in your eye of just like this might get me in trouble.
so what is it's always one of those things where you say, okay, I'm going to talk about what the good of a thing is and then the bad of a thing. And then we're going
Right,
to go
yeah.
that route. Well, first of all, to what is the craft of acting? So I think starting there is a great place to start. Um, and really, whether you're a person of faith or not, I think that almost everyone would agree that the act of crafting is the act of incarnation. Um, it is the act of ensouling a character, essentially. You become as you put on that character, you become that which animates that character, and then your decisions about everything from that character's tone of voice to the way they walk, to the pause they take every time they're about to say the word September, whatever the case may be. Um, it is the incarnation. It's incarnational. It's why I think, back to what you said earlier about how, as human beings, the natural thing for us to do is to communicate through telling stories. I think it's just woven into all of us, and I think all of us do it in different ways. Acting, in a sense, is an easy default way because it's an easy thing to point out as an act of incarnation. But just as you're making pipes, I mean, there's a sense of what you just said. The wood is a block of wood until it's given form, right? You have the earth was was formless and void, right? Um, and the spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. Everything is about giving shape, and that's what an actor is doing. They're giving a form. I think I was Jordan Peterson I heard say one time, and I really enjoy a lot of what he has to say. Talked about the difference between everything these days has sort of been like get rid of guide boundaries, get rid of boundaries so that put um, you don't put any kind of constraint on anything. And his question was, how do you know what the shape of something is without the outline? And that, when it comes to acting, that's what you're doing. You're taking all of these pieces, you're taking dialogue and stage direction, and you're taking the author's own biases and hurts and joys and everything that's put into that character, and you're shaping them into your interpretation of it. And that's the other thing to remember too, I think, with regard to acting, is that every character, if you had 5 different people play a particular character, look at any great author. Shakespeare obviously is the first one that comes to mind. How many Othellos have there been? How many Hamlets have there been? Everybody has their own, they're saying the same words, but everybody has their own interpretation. And so you're giving form to something, and that's what you're doing as an actor, is you're giving form. Um, some of the tricks of the trade for actors. This is what in my own approach to acting, what I almost always do is I just read the whole script. Whether that's a screenplay, whether it is a stage play, a short story that you're going to portray a character from, an excerpt from something. I just read the whole thing so that you know, and again, this goes back to the shape of it. You know what the shape is. This story from beginning to end, this is the arc. And then you ask yourself, what is the actor's part in the story? What is it that they are facilitating? How is what they do serving the story? Because when we look at that aspect of it, even if you are the only person in a show, if it's a one-man show, you're still not the show. The story is what should be front and center, and you are serving that story through the performance that you're giving. And so acting right there is an act of self-sacrifice. It's an act of submission to a greater purpose. And the greater purpose is always that story. Um,
Well, and just to have you, not to jam you up there, because I
no,
mean
no, no,
this
go
is
for it.
all really good, but you keep using the word servant too, which
Yes.
jumps out to me as like, so essentially, like an actor acting properly, maybe we could say, is they're acting as a steward of the great story. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's essentially what you're trying to do, in much the same way that I'm a steward of the craft of teaching and of woodworking.
That's exactly right. Exactly. You're a steward, and as an actor, you're a steward of a couple of things, really a few things. Because acting, even if you're the only person in a show, if you're the actor in the show, but then it's on a stage, then you've probably got art direction and set dressing, and you've probably got a director, and you've probably got props masters. There's still a community aspect to it. There's always a sense of there's a body around a story, and the body is the way in which the story finally gets communicated, even if what the audience is seeing seems to be wrapped around the actor and their performance. But most of the time, you're acting with people. And so, what you're a steward of is you're a steward not only of the story itself, you're also a steward of your own character. You're also a steward in terms of the relationships within the story of one actor to another. So that we could even go back to some of the language that's typically used in terms of how Catholic social teaching and even in our theology, um, you have to be rightly ordered within your approach to acting. And the first thing that you always, just like we're taught in our catechism, we're made to love, know, and serve God. And in a sense, if you incorporate that into your role and job as an actor, you're in a way, your role is to love, know, and serve the story. That's really what it is. And part of that is not only serving the story itself and then also being a steward of your own character, but it's also being a steward of the relationships developed between the characters within the story. Because everyone is essentially working toward the same goal. And so part of the approach as an actor, it's one of the reasons you read the whole script. There are jokes all the time about actors that only read their own lines. And they read their own lines, and then they read the last line that is the cue line for them before their next line. Now, some of that's an exaggeration, and some of that's not. If you want to talk about bad acting, that's what bad acting is. Um, and so there is that sense you have to know the whole story because you have to know your place within it. You have to understand how that's ordered in order for you to rightly act within that story. So that's part of the way you approach it. There's a great line. There's a movie. I'm not going to endorse or recommend this movie, but it's a funny movie. It's a movie called Tropic Thunder. And there's a great line in it. Robert Downey Jr.'s character is playing another character. And when one character asks him, "Did you read the script?" he says, "I don't read the script. The script reads me."
That's hilarious. Yeah.
so there's an example of a purposefully portrayed pretentious self-absorbed actor. And so it's a great line. It's a fantastic line. But yeah, so that's the approach. You read the entire script, you understand the fullness of the picture, right? You understand what it is from beginning to end and what your place in it is. Then from there, you start to look at the character. You start to break down the lines of the character, the relationships of the character to the other actors. And then at some point, you find the character. And that is a really interesting process because part of it is going through memorization. Part of it is walking around your house or your apartment, saying those lines, and then asking yourself what emotions are being or what emotions are rising up in you as you say these particular lines, and you think about this person in relationship to either the characters or circumstances that they find themselves. And suddenly, at some point, you find your hook, and the hook is almost always something that you go back to at any point you need to refine the character. It can be the way you walk. It can be the fact that the character has a limp. It can be the fact that you chose to do an accent for the character. It can be the fact that that character's secret, even though it may not be in the script, and there's some controversy about using things for motivation that aren't explicitly in a script. But it may be that you have decided that based on some information in the script, that character's motivation is something none of the other characters know about. Whatever it is, it's the center point that you go back to every time you want to ask the question, who is that character? Who is this character? And in a sense, it's almost for us, it's like the Holy Spirit. It's that sense of saying, where's my North Star? What leads me? And anytime I get lost, where do I go back to? Or for some of us, of course, it's adoration or the Eucharist. But the truth of the matter is, it's always in life, it is always the presence of God. It is always the Holy Spirit in us because we are his temple. And in acting, it's whatever you find is that hook. It might even be a line within the script, a single line of dialogue that embodies all of what this character is meant to be and do when rightly ordered within this story.
So I have a comment and a question.
Let's do it.
So the comment is like when you were explaining like walking around your house and saying the lines and trying to like essentially embody this character that you're not. To me,
Yes.
that like I think that's where I've never been and like had the capacity to do acting is because like that that dance of being like it sounds like you're being very internal, but then
Uh-huh.
also very external at the
Yeah,
same time. And that is where I like I'm either one or the and that is like for me like that's a skill. Like that's definitely like that's like
it
a
is.
craft that I could. So like, uh, I guess I've got that's my comment, and then I guess I have two questions off of that.
Yes,
So
two-parter.
like, so like, uh, uh, um, like what's going through your mind when you're doing something like that, right?
Mhm.
That's what I'm just terribly interested in that. And then I've seen you act as Professor Nuance
Yes.
uh, in the Theater of the Word production, Socrates Meets Jesus, which
Uh-huh.
I loved it. Like I've watched it like 5 times now, and I tell everybody,
You
I'm like,
you
you
might hold the
have to
record for
watch it.
anybody.
What's that?
You might hold the record for how many times anyone's ever watched it.
Well, it's so great. I mean, like it just such a great production for the audience that might be listening to this. It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free.
Yes, that's right.
It is it's based off of the book by Dr.
Peter
Peter,
Kraft. That's
right?
right. Yeah.
Socrates Meets Jesus. You guys wrote a screenplay for it? Or,
So Kevin adapted the book. Kevin O'Brien
okay,
adapted the book, right, to a stage play. That's
okay.
correct. And there had been, for a while, there
Stage
had been a
play,
little
I'm
bit of
sorry.
talk. Yeah, no, that's quite all right. For a while, there had actually been a little bit of talk about what it would look like to potentially film it. That never came to fruition, but we were really fortunate to get the opportunity to perform it on stage numerous times, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I mean, and it is incredible because like there are just so many uh, you know incredible moments. Like that. Like probably my favorite moment is when I can't remember who the lady's name was.
Molly, I think is,
Molly, yes.
yeah,
Molly, she's like, well, Jesus was a prophet, and Socrates is, so was I, and
that's right.
he goes through it, and like, it's like that. That's just like it really really captured that character. So obviously, like Kevin's character playing Socrates, he was like the main character of. Well, I guess you
That's
could
right.
make the argument that 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 the other kid, he also kind of took a main role toward the end, that like he had this conversion like experience take place in his life. That you were Professor Nuance. So
Yes.
like walk me through. You said that there's like a hook that you
Mhm.
discover that you would say like makes that character come forward. What was that for you, and what was the process like to get into the Professor Nuance character?
Wow, this is fun, man. Because I get to dig a little bit into this. I haven't performed that show in quite some time, and the development of that character was something that happened what now feels like a long time ago. But I do remember at least a few very distinct things about it. So we'll talk first about acting as a physical act, right? The place in which I found Professor Nuance in the physical aspect of him was the voice. So that's where it started for me. And there's a line I talked earlier about those lines that go back to, you go back to that and you're like, okay, that's the character. So there's a line he has where he's asking Socrates about, now that he's gone through this course, essentially Professor Nuance's course on ethics or whatever, right? And on the life of Christ. I think it was Christology 101 or something.
Yeah,
And uh, and Professor Nuance says to Socrates, he says, uh, "What did you learn?" Is what he says, and is what did you discover? What did you learn? And it's interesting because the way he says it, it's a little bit mocking because Socrates has actually had a conversion. Socrates recognizes how Christ so completely outpaces him in every way, but also all other philosophies that have been presented to him at this point. And um, Dr. Nuance is kind of mocking him a little bit at that point where he's asking that question, but he's also asking it with a masked, sincere curiosity. Because for him, all these things that he's taught all along, he's just teaching them. And he doesn't believe any of them. That's kind of the point. He's really, for the most part, he's just a relativist. And so, but what has happened through the course, and this is me internalizing this for this character, what's happened through the course of the discussion with Socrates and Molly, is he's heard some things that he's never heard before in terms of how they've been put. And they've been put so irrefutably that he's starting to have his own doubts. And so for me, that whole end scene where he's asking that question mockingly, he's not only asking it, he's doing that as self-preservation, but he's also doing that because he wants to see what Socrates' answer is. And that's why at the very end he gets so angry when Socrates starts talking about truth, because he realizes that he's been confronted with something that now requires him to make a decision. And so for me, that was what it was always kind of building up to with that character, was that line right there. What did you discover? What did you learn? Was always him going. It's his last defense against, I have to make a choice now. If I stay indifferent, then I'm being intellectually dishonest. It doesn't mean he's, after the show is over, it doesn't mean he went and like had a come to Jesus moment. Like, but what it does mean is that he could no longer just sort of dismiss all the things that he'd always dismissed, because he found somebody who actually challenged those beliefs in a way that were that had to be answered. So that was where I found the character in that line, and that was the motivation behind that line. In terms of him as a character physically, there are a couple of other lines that he said. One of the things is he never says the Old Testament. He always says the Hebrew Scriptures.
Yeah,
is the
yeah, yeah,
is the way that he would refer to the Old Testament. So he would always say, "I loved it because it was pretentious." That he would say it that
yeah,
way.
yeah.
And so for me, that informed part of him too. He was a pretentious person, but again, he was pretentious out of self-preservation. And then the other thing was, as any good sort of relativistic modern day professor, he would always say BCE. He would never say BC or AD.
Yep.
Or he would say CE. I love when he would say the Common Era,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
because again, for me, those lines embodied that these were facades, these were glass houses, and they were for him things that had never truly been intellectually challenged at his own level. And Socrates is getting dangerously close to shattering these really, really fragile walls that he's built, because most of his students are not unintelligent, they're just not curious enough. That's the problem. And um, and so for me, building that character, it was a lot about the language, things like BCE and Hebrew scriptures, all the pretentious things that he did. In terms of character physicality, I did two things. I did the voice that I just did, and then whenever I would walk across the stage, I would do so with my arms folded behind my back, as though I were extremely important. So
Yeah, yeah.
that was a little bit of the incarnation that went into
Okay.
that character.
Well, and kind of the way that you were describing that, if I'm remembering the Gospels correctly, it's almost kind of like he's like a Herod type of character in the sense that, if
Yes.
I'm remembering right, Herod would uh, like he wanted to hear what John the
Hmm.
Baptist had to say, but he couldn't ever admit, that John the Baptist was right, because then that would undo. He would have to conform his life to
That's exactly right.
right, and that's
I think he's a very Herod character. In fact, that's awesome that you bring that out. I never connected that. That's fantastic. I love it.
yeah. I think that that's kind of at least that's the sense that I get of it. But yeah, I mean, like that's kind of the. And what is it like to play? Because you are not a person like that. Like you, you don't. You're
I
not
hope not. I really
this like
hope not.
you. Well, like in our book club, you would sit back and listen to like what everybody had to say, and then be very thoughtful of what everyone had to say, and then give your insights, which were always very, very good. So I mean, like that was why it was so entertaining to watch. You play the character, because it's like that's not really the way that you are at all. Like you
Mm.
are not a person that would get up with your arms behind your back and call scriptures and talk, you know, in this very very uh, what would you say, um, egotistical
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
things. You don't strike me as that at all. So I mean, what
Maybe
would
that's just under the surface.
well, yeah, but I mean, would you say it was fun to play that role, or what did you find it to be challenging?
Oh, I loved playing that character. It was so
Okay,
fun. As an actor, a lot of times the things that are most fun is to play the characters that are most unlike you.
okay,
Um, because you would never be that way in real life, or it would be very unlikely that you would be that way in real life. Also, it forces you, sometimes it's actually a little bit more challenging to play a character too close to what you're actually like. Um, believe it or not, there's a greater vulnerability there. And so, and also sometimes what you can find is that you're not playing a character, you're just you're just playing yourself. And so to play a character that's much different than you are is typically really fun. And it's also that point where you start really incorporating the things I was talking about earlier with past experiences, with people you observe. One of the things that you have to be as an actor is you have got to be a student of human nature. You have to watch people and observe how they move. You have to ask yourself questions about why in the world they did that in public. Just all the things that make us human in a sense as far as our actions go. And so playing a character unlike yourself is actually a lot of fun. And I had a great time with that character.
so so like based off what you were just saying, like why did that person do that in public? I imagine that who was that presidential candidate? Was it Howard Dean that did the famous like
The famous-
oh, was that was
yes.
that just like acting gold at that point? That is
Oh
just
my gosh, all the late
right.
night hosts just had so much material just from that. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing you do. You look at things like that. And the other thing about that, though, is you have to recognize that in that moment, because as human beings, we have a tendency to think that our actions in this time in time and space, that it is somehow the most disruptive thing that's ever happened on Earth in the history of the Earth, because it's happening to us, right? And so you have to also be able to absorb that aspect of the consequences of those actions, because if you're going to play a character, you have to be able to say, okay, what motivated the action in the first place, and find something even if you're not 100% correct. But then you also have to say, okay, well, what were the repercussions of the action, and how do I get into that headspace too? And so it's so 360 degrees in terms of of applying that form to a character. A character can't just be a character who's gregarious, or a character who's melancholy, or a character who has a super cool scar. Like, a character has to be all of those things at once. And so consistently being observant about human behavior um, is necessary in order to make sure that your characters also don't end up two-dimensional. So that, and I'm not really sure if that really even addresses what you just said, but for some reason that's what came into my mind. So, um, but yeah, it is. There are things that happen both publicly and privately that if you're around an actor at some point, they're probably going to use that on stage.
Um, so was there anything else you wanted to talk about with regard to like the craft of acting itself that you think um like that maybe people don't know a whole lot about that maybe um that might be interesting to for people to hear about or anything like that?
I think a couple of brief things. This is on the technical side, but in case anybody watches this who is either considering that this as a career, or who really wants to just take it more seriously and develop their own acting, um, probably the greatest acting teacher that we refer to in the West, um, Konstantin Stanislavski. He developed something called the method. And you'll hear a lot of times, even in television shows, when people are joking about acting, they'll talk about, oh, that's so method, or you're just a method actor, whatever the case may be. Um, Stanislavski's approach to acting was that you have to find a way to be able to live in front of the audience. And when he said that, what he meant was you wanted to be able to be as natural in front of the audience as you were when sitting and you and I having a conversation right now. If the audience can tell you're acting, to go back to what you said earlier, that's bad acting. um,
Okay.
if they go, wow, that guy's trying really hard, you don't want them paying attention to that. You want the audience, when they're watching the performance, to get lost in the performance because they're not seeing you. The method that Stanislavski developed for that was, in large part, what I've just talked about in terms of observation. He was a huge proponent of sitting in parks on benches and watching people walk by. He was a huge proponent of watching, going to a zoo and watching people as they fed the animals. And then he was also a huge proponent of exercises on stage that were simply meant to acclimate the actor to existing in that space as though they were sort of sprung out of the earth right there. The whole idea was to be comfortable in your space so that the actions and the reactions which an actor is moving in that space with are natural. They're not put on. Now, granted, you have blocking and you have the characterization that you develop that I just talked about, but the thing that's necessary to do, and I'll say this, and this isn't me just trying to make him sound like a great guy. When we were doing Socrates Meets Jesus, there were numerous times while doing that show when Kevin was in the middle of that longer monologue near the end, where Socrates has discovered the vastness and sort of the incomparability of what this truth would mean if Jesus Christ is who he said he was. That, because I didn't have lines for a while, I would forget that I was on stage watching Kevin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what we're
Which is a wild thing to
oh, it
got
is.
all these people watching you, and you're like, oh.
Oh, it's like, oh crap, that's my cue line. Like it but that's what we're meant to do. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier. The sacrificial aspect, the self-sacrificial aspect of acting is for you to disappear and for the character to become what's in front of the audience. You are giving yourself, you're pouring yourself out. St. Paul says, I've poured myself out like a libation.
Mhm.
You are pouring yourself into that character so that, as St. John the Baptist said, I must become less and he must become greater. That's what, by the way, that's one of my favorite scriptures. That is what acting should be. That's what the method should be. The reason I mention the method is because these days, what the method is associated with is it is associated with actors who stay in character for 13 to 15 hours on set. They never break and talk to people as themselves. They just stay in that character. There's a really beautifully done film from China from about 14 years ago, where one of the end scenes is these three women basically just weeping because of this very tragic event that's taken place on set for that entire day. And shoot days are long on major motion pictures. Shoot days are typically 12 to 14 hours, and then sometimes much longer. Those women didn't stop weeping all day long on set. I understand the desire to stay in the character, but at that point, in my opinion, it's not acting. The method was never meant to be, you don't break character ever. The method was meant to be, you as a craftsman, going back to what this whole podcast is about, you learn how to utilize the tools that you've developed so that when you step on stage, when you get in front of that camera, when you walk out into the city center and do a live performance in front of a fountain, you are as natural in that space as you would be in your living room reading a book. That's what the method is supposed to be. And so that's kind of nerdy and that's kind of specific, but it really is for anybody who's considering acting. If you read Stanislavski, read him through that lens. It is about the naturalistic approach to and craft of acting. It is not about, as Robert De Niro did, and I think it's a ridiculous thing, that when he was going to make Taxi Driver back in the 70s, he actually came to New York and got a job as a taxi driver and worked as a taxi driver. And I'm like, it's not acting at that point. At that point, it is you going, I want to get so comfortable in this that it's not because I've studied it and I've developed that character, and nothing against Robert De Niro. The man is a phenomenal actor, but that is not method acting. That's getting a job as a taxi driver and then being a taxi driver in a movie. And there are differences in my opinion. Acting is a craft and it's meant to be utilized and employed again in right order. So that is that's my speech and spiel on the nerd craft of acting.
Well, no, and I mean, like, everything you just said through our entire conversation. So I'll give a shout out to a movie that people should go and see. I think is and I don't recommend people go see most modern
Most
movies.
movies.
But over this past weekend, I went to go see Nefarious.
Yes.
And have you seen it?
I haven't yet, but I spoke with a friend recently who did, and they said it is probably one of the best films in terms of what we were talking about earlier for communicating a message, but doing it with a really well developed craft.
Well, and so you can listen to Sean Patrick Flannery.
Hmm.
He he's he's done several interviews. He did an interview. I don't know if you listened to Church Militant or not, but he did an
I
interview with
haven't, no.
Michael Voris.
Okay.
You could look at any of the interviews that he's done on YouTube or in the news media, and it's like jarring to hear him talk about it because like you do hear a lot of the time of like actors like, yeah, in order for me to get into that character I went and like, I don't know, like Leonardo DiCaprio probably went and fought a grizzly bear for whatever that movie
The
was.
Revenant, yeah, right.
Yeah, I haven't even seen it. I just remember like it's like the movie that he finally got an Oscar for or something like.
It's an amazing film, but
Yeah,
yeah.
but in any case, like we're kind of used to hearing, actors going and doing stuff like what you were describing with
Hmm.
with Robert De Niro. Um, but to hear Sean Patrick Flannery talk about it, he was just like, I read the script. I immediately knew he's like, if I could get this role, he's like, you don't get scripts like this ever. And he was like, and he was like, so I was excited about the script. I read the whole thing, was just entranced by it, knew that I had to try to get this role. So he was excited about it. But then he was just, like people were like, well, like, what was your method? And he was like, "Well, I just went and basically portrayed what I thought was going to be a demon." And
There you go.
he was like, and then I would, like go in, I would do that depiction, and then we would cut, and I would go right back to being normal again. And
Yep, that's right.
like in between shooting, I would go and see. I think he said that he has his sons do wrestling and stuff like that. So he's like, I
Nice.
would go and see their wrestling meets, and he was like, none of that attached itself to me. He's like I was in character when the camera was on, and when the camera shut off, I was talking with the other actor that played opposite of him.
Right.
And it is a great film that it creates so much suspense and so much drama, being that it's just two people talking.
Yeah.
I mean, but it is, and I don't want to ruin the film for anybody, but I mean, it is incredibly suspenseful. But I think that you can stream it starting June 2nd on something. So I don't. But in any case, but what you have described is essentially what meshes up extremely well with what Sean Patrick Flannery was describing when I was watching the interviews that he had done on that stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but if that's all you want to talk about with regard to the craft, then I just wanted to ask a couple of knee jerk questions before we get into to other aspects. What are some of your favorite movies? Like, what do you think? Like from an aspect of like uh, acting well, and you don't have to go
Mhm.
into it if you don't want to. But I mean, like Chariots of Fire, you said that that's a movie that you really like. Are there any other ones
Mhm.
that really jump out to you?
Well, my favorite movie of all time, I never have any trouble knowing what that is Singing in the Rain. So that, first of all, I'm a massive fan of musicals, and but there are many reasons why I like Singing in the Rain. It's a movie about making movies, and I always love movies about making movies. It's a movie that chronicles the transition from silent pictures to sound, and that's one of the hallmark events in filmmaking, or in motion picture production, is when they went from silent to sound. These are kind of the technical reasons why I like it. It's a film that was co-directed by the actor and what some would argue was the greatest motion picture dancer and choreographer of all time, Gene Kelly, and then one of the other greatest directors of all time of motion picture musicals, Stanley Donen. It was written by Adolph Green, or I should say Comden and Green, and uh, the way that it was brought about was the producer of the picture brought them basically just a bunch of songs and said, "We've got an idea about doing a picture that is going to chronicle this actor's fall from fame because he's never spoken a line of dialogue in his life because he's always done silent pictures, and he has to suddenly be thrust into the world of sound and musicals and all the rest of it." And he said, "So here's a bunch of songs. We think there's going to be something in the movie about singing in the rain. That might even be a song title. And now write a story about it." And so that's all they had to go on. And they wrote what most people agree should have been the script that never worked. And it has worked so well. Those are all sort of the technical and nerdy reasons I like that film. But one of the things I love about that film, and this goes back to what we talked about very early on in our discussion today, is that sense of the transcendent, that sense of the world's bigger than it looks. In that movie, Gene Kelly's character is this massive star, and he's transitioning from just basically pantomiming on screen, as they call it, to now having to deliver these lines. And he's not a Shakespearean actor; he doesn't know how to deliver dialogue, and he has this life, death, and then resurrection sort of arc where he has to recognize his own limitations. He has to remember what got him to where he was in the first place. And he reinvents himself essentially in the film. But there are all of these aspects that play into that arc where he can't do it by himself. He has to rely on the help of a good friend, a friend who has stuck with him from the time they, in the film, the characters were doing vaudeville together to where they started doing motion pictures up until the present day in the film. Um, but there's the sense of a character having to empty themselves of what they thought made them valuable, what they thought made them great, and then allow themselves in that death um, to then be reborn. You know, a seed doesn't produce fruit unless first it falls into the earth and dies. There's that aspect of it. God has always given me this sensitivity to the transcendent within stories and even secular stories. So yeah, my favorite movie of all time is Singing in the Rain. Some of the greatest music, some of the greatest dance choreography, a fantastic love story. I mean, it's all there. That's, to me, if you want to talk about what Hollywood did well during the golden age of filmmaking, that movie is the epitome of that because it's got everything. So I love that movie. I the first movie I ever saw in theaters that I chose was not a movie that will ever be remembered by almost anyone except for someone who was either my age at the time or just happens to be a huge fan of this particular property. But the first movie I ever chose to see in the theater, and my dad just suffered through it, which I was grateful for, was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And but what's amazing about that film is that we all know that today, much of what we see in films, even smaller films, is CGI. It's computer generated. They either don't have much in the way of sets, or they don't have much in the way of practical effects. Each of the actors in that film, and this goes back to craft, each of the actors in that film who played one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, while they were on set doing all of the stunts, the acrobatics, and the martial arts, were wearing an 80-pound costume, and all of them were elite level martial artists. And so looking at them do things like in an 80-pound suit, looking at them do things like kep ups, and looking at them do things like leg sweeps, and just these pratfalls that they would do. There were a couple of places where you could tell in the film when they would like throw the turtle through a wall that it was just the suit, which was kind of funny because it would just bend in ways it shouldn't have. But um, but I remember that too because from the standpoint of practical effects, it was so neat to see the craftsmen, in this case the costumers, take the time to make these super lifelike costumes that had fully functional animatronic faces, and bring to life these characters. I love that film. I always will love that film. It has really no in it has no lasting redeeming quality, but it's so much fun. Um, but I think that talking about films in terms of, and stories in terms of calling us to something higher. There's an amazing scene in the film Casablanca, and everybody knows it. It's in Rick's place, and Victor Laszlo, who is this underground resistance fighter, he's there, and the Nazis don't really know he's who he is. He's sort of incognito. And there's this group of Nazis who stand around the piano, and they ask the pianist to start to play this sort of Nazi anthem, right? And they start singing it. And Victor Laszlo walks up to the actual band who's on stage, and he tells them to play the Marseillaise. And the band won't do it because they're afraid of getting in trouble with the Nazis, and they're afraid of what the Rick's place might get shut down. And there's this fantastic scene where Humphrey Bogart walks into the main area of the bar, and the band all look at him, and he just all he does is he nods, and they start to play the Marseillaise. And then one by one, the people in the place, except for the Nazis, of course, they start to stand up and they start to sing the Marseillaise. And before you know it, there is this chorus of people, and they are just pouring the sorrow and the suffering out of themselves in this national anthem as a sign of resistance against the evil that has visited them. And they have thrown caution to the wind, and they don't care what the consequences are. But and there's a great shot. It's a woman stands up and she just starts singing it, and she's just tears are flooding her face. To me, that scene is an embodiment of what happens when someone pierced with the truth of the gospel casts aside all hindrances and says, I will stand for Christ. And again, it is a way in which God has given me this, I don't know, for me, it's a privilege to see in stories what is pointed to that is greater than the story. Um, that's another one of my favorite films. I love that scene.
Yeah, and it is wild how, scenes like that well, I mean, like when you were explaining that, I was thinking of the movie Sound of Music with
Yes.
the Edelweiss scene.
Yes.
I mean, very, very similar.
Very similar.
And then when you were talking about the Singing in the Rain, one of my favorite films is I have to watch it every Christmas. Is It's a Wonderful Life,
It's a Wonderful Life. Yep, that's
and
right.
because it is that life, death, resurrection type of
That it is.
background. And well, I mean, and just so much great wisdom is gained by watching a lot of those films that
Mhm.
are just so incredible. Like one of my favorite scenes is in It's a Wonderful Life. Like uh, the it's It's his mom who looks at her, and she's like head over heels over what's going to be his wife. And
Yes.
and she's like, well, you know that you need to, listen to Mary. She has all of the answers. And
She has all the answers. That's
and
exactly
it's a
right.
brilliant, it's just and it's like, there's just so many, as a young man, you watch that, and it's not going to make sense to you. It's kind of like reading Lord of the Rings when you're 17 versus reading when you're 34, or
That's
44.
right.
And so yeah, I mean, that's kind of what makes um, what makes for great cinema is when you see that character pierced by by the good,
Hmm.
by the truth of the gospel, we'll say. But then it also pierces you as well. I mean,
It
like
does.
it has that. I mean, there are movies that I'll watch that I can barely keep it together. I love the Shawshank Redemption,
Oh my gosh, right?
and seeing the scene with I mean the rooftop scene,
Hmm.
when they have that feeling of freedom,
Yes.
and stuff like that. Uh, and then of course when Andy, is standing in the creek with the rain coming down,
Yeah.
it's incredible, and it really really it does it it's like to talk of like orientation, being
Yes.
properly oriented, is that it isn't like emotion for the sake of emotion.
It
It's
is
like
not.
emotion that directs you to something higher. and
That's right.
and in my own life, that has led me further from darkness and closer to the light, which is, I think, a hallmark of great cinema and great acting. um,
Well, and that's really what great art should do. It doesn't matter. A lot of people think that it's impossible, not impossible. I think a lot of people have the impression that unless it's something that we think of as great art, it doesn't necessarily have the power to point us there. But the truth of the matter is, whether you're reading Shakespeare or you're looking at a Caravaggio painting or you're watching The Princess Bride, like they're
that's another great.
in I love that movie. That's another once a year one for me. Um, I mean, the whole message of that film is that nothing can defeat true love. And granted, in the film, it's in the context of the love between a man and a woman, which is, the second greatest way. But the whole the whole shape of that story is the shape of the lover who comes to rescue the beloved, right? And what happened for us, that exact same thing happened for us, except it happened on a cosmic scale. And so um, that's what great art should do.
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely. Well, and that's the whole, that's the whole point of my work as a craftsman, is to, I mean, it is one of those things that when I'm not exaggerating, like when I give someone a piece of furniture that I've made, um, without being able to understand what all went into that, they like they without it's like if you were to go and see the Sistine Chapel, like
Yeah,
like you would look up at the ceiling and you would see all of this amazing artwork. You don't have to have a degree in art, just absolutely appreciate and be swallowed up in the beauty of
that's
what
right.
you're witnessing. And it's my art, my craft is a much more humble craft than that. But truly, when you do hand someone something that has been made the best that you can make it, they know, like they
They do.
immediately understand and are transported somewhere better, because it's like, you uh, you thought that much of me, to suffer, like
That's right.
because that's one thing,
That's right.
like to make something by hand, and I imagine that the same is true with acting. I mean, like
Hmm.
the creative force. is not one that just comes willy nilly. It's something that
Yeah.
that it takes an act of will, and it's not always easy to be able to do that. And it draws out the very best in you to come forward. And there's something about that that's intoxicatingly powerful. And when we get to
It's
see
true.
um, acted out, it really it can you know certainly orient us in the right direction. So
Absolutely.
so yeah, I love that talk that we just had.
Me too.
But I did just want to ask. Uh, I guess we'll save the best for last.
Okay.
Which is I want to talk with you about our experience together going through the Lord of the Rings, and
Yeah.
specifically by looking at the films and what impact those had on you, and what your
Absolutely.
opinion of them is as an actor. But I guess just briefly, what's your opinion of Hollywood? Like, what is it
Hmm.
that you think of where Hollywood is headed? Because I think that a lot of people, me being one of them, so I don't hide anything from anybody, but I don't think that Hollywood is serving the right master any longer. I don't necessarily get the sense that they're making too many films these days that are uh, um, orienting us, transporting us somewhere better. Like I don't necessarily see a lot of Hollywood movies just willing for the good of the other.
Hmm.
Now, and we had talked about this before we had done this podcast, that to what degree that's Hollywood's fault or to what degree that's our fault as
Right.
consumers is subject to great debate. But
Hmm.
do you think that Hollywood is on the right track? And if not, or if so, what do you think that they should keep doing or should not do?
That's a really big subject. That's a really big subject. First of all, Hollywood, as we think of it, it's not as unified as it might be easy to like to think of it as. Um, and there isn't Hollywood is a company town. Everybody that lives in Hollywood or many of the people that live in Los Angeles are involved in the movie production industry somehow or something that feeds into it, right? So the first thing Hollywood is Hollywood's a business. That's really what it comes down to. And I think that in terms of what Hollywood is producing, I think that Hollywood is a reflection in a lot of ways more than it is. Um, I think it's a reflection of where we are at as a culture more than it is making the culture. Now, it might be unhealthily reinforcing the things uh, that are not willing the good of the other. But I don't think it's as much leading the culture as maybe some people would think. We did talk about this a little bit before. There is a sense that people go and see films because they have that desire to want to see that particular thing. And that Hollywood, because it is a business, if something wasn't making them money, they are very likely not going to produce more of that thing, or they'll only produce as much of it as actually profitable for them. So if you look at the types of films that are being produced that are not um, films that um, encourage virtue and films that encourage self-sacrifice and the various things that we look at as willing the good. Um, the fact that people go and see them in droves the way they do, and if you really want to get down into it now, because the the visit to the motion picture theater is so much less common than it used to be because there's so much available to stream now. And so many Hollywood production studios and actors and people involved in the industry are also now feeding into the streaming services that are creating original content for distribution on those platforms. And so, because that's the case, Hollywood is sort of expanded in terms of what we're seeing that we can call Hollywood. And what Hollywood is producing is largely they're producing it in response to what people are willing to pay for. And it's funny. Recently, I was reading some parts of Henry V, and among the many amazing lines in that play, there's a scene where King Henry, disguised, is having a discussion with a couple of soldiers, Williams and Bates, and they're talking about how if the war against the French goes ill, that it's essentially on the king's head, because if the king's cause be just, then God will essentially favor us with victory. If it, however, goes ill, then we can't be blamed, and the king is the one to be blamed um, for any evil that comes upon the English people due to the fact that they've started this war. And so Henry is participating in this discussion in disguise, and he's not making a full-throated defense of his own decisions, but he's sort of pushing back against the comments that these two soldiers are making. And he comes to a section where they have again sort of reiterated all the evils that might be a part of this decision. We can't be blamed, and we consider ourselves innocent of whatever our participation in this is. And Henry says something really interesting. He says, each subject's duty is the king's, but each subject's soul is his own. And there is a responsibility that the power has to operate with the same orientation and virtue as everyone else has. And yet at the same time, individually, we are responsible for what we not only produce, but also consume. And we're responsible for the state of our souls. And if the state of our souls is bettered by going and seeing a film, we should do it. And if the state of our souls is worsened by doing that same thing, we should not. And if we cannot bring ourselves to abstain from things that do not will the good, then I think it is unrealistic and also irresponsible for us to lay an inordinate amount of blame on those who produce the content that we ingest or that we participate in. So no, I don't think by and large the majority of what's being produced in films from Hollywood is calling us to that higher purpose that for which we're created. And I also don't think that we're demanding that they do it. So that to me is kind of my take on it right now. And it's also the thing that, particularly for artists of faith, it's the thing that should be a clarion call for us to say, this is a place in which we need to step in and begin to really participate in the production of art that will do that for people. And as we talked about earlier, the balance between message and medium, so many artists who are people of faith, they focus so heavily on the message that they forget that the art needs to be there too. I'm actually really impressed with what Dallas Jenkins has done with The Chosen.
I was just thinking the whole time that you were talking about this, I was like, we have to bring up the Chosen. So
We really do. Not every series that chronicles the life of Christ is not everything can be that series, and not everything should be. But that was what he was tasked to do. The Holy Spirit led him to do that, and now he's doing it. And I think he's doing an amazing job.
right.
And he is making sure to pay attention to the nuances of the performances, of the art direction, of the writing, and of all the other things that go into the craft of filmmaking, as much as he is paying attention to making sure that he has theologians on staff and that he is making sure that the message of the gospel is not compromised, watered down, or obscured in any way. Mr. Jenkins is doing it right. But we also need creators who aren't just making stories about the life of Christ. We need creators who are making action films about self-sacrifice. And so that you can take a hero And the reason that he's a hero is not because he wears, six different types of guns and he can jump out of airplanes, and all the other things, which are so cool to watch, but because he or she, um, recognizes that there is a greater good to be accomplished, even if it's at the cost of their own life. And that's the central theme of the story. You can still have all the explosions you want. You can still have all the cool airplane, dog fights and car chases and all the other things that make for a great popcorn summer action film. But at the heart of it, wrapped in all that beautiful, glistening action, make sure that the story of the character is one of a character who abandons self for the sake of the greater. And if I want to point to a modern movie franchise that I think interestingly does that fairly well, I actually think the Mission Impossible movies do that really well. Tom Cruise has become one of the most respected stuntmen in the world. And he's kind of made his bread and butter off of these big spectacle action films, particularly that franchise. But what's really interesting is that him and then whoever the team of people around him in the film is as the main characters, they are always working toward an end that is going to rescue either a part of the population or much of the population or a particular group of people or a particular individual from certain catastrophe and doing it at the risk of their own lives. And it's actually done really well. And I don't, he's always said that his goal is to entertain people, and he's doing that for certain. But what's interesting about that franchise in particular is that he does the other thing really well. And I think if more of our artists who are people of faith told grand stories with really good art and encapsulated within that art this powerful, piercing message, we would see people respond to it because I think people are hungry for truth.
Yeah, and like my confession with regard to films that I really, really like, or just stories that I really, really love, are when the hero dies in the end.
Yeah.
And I think that like a more modern film that came out that yeah, and again, my brother is such a blessing to have in my life because he's about your age, and
Okay.
when I was a kid, if it was a good film, it was because my brother liked it, and he happened to have an eye for really, really great films. But the movie Gladiator, I mean,
Yes.
that's I think a wonderful example of. I would show that film to my students, and they would always be super, super sad when Maximus dies, and I would be like, but it couldn't be any other way.
No.
Like he wouldn't have been as great of a hero had he not laid it all on the line. Like like that's why we ultimately like it. But I would say that one of my criticisms of a lot of the more modern films, like I didn't, the Marvel series, like everybody really
Hmm.
got into all of that, but I didn't like how it was like they didn't want the heroes to die. At the end of that film, because it was like,
Right.
it was like they, like vanished and dissipated, but then they came back, and some of them were to be no more, and and it's like, I guess, like for me, it's that idea that it's like, uh, and I think that that is kind of a poison of our culture that you're kind of seeing right now is that people are clinging on to life.
Yes.
Um,
And trying to extend it.
well, and you see this like as the older generation continues to age, they're not aging naturally. Like they're like wanting to get all the plastic surgery, and they're wanting to, um, cling to their youth. I just saw earlier that Al Pacino um,
Hmm.
just fathered a new child with his 27-year-old wife, and he's 83, I think. And it's just
Wow.
like, I mean, it's like talk about like clinging on to something that isn't rightfully yours. I mean, it's like, uh,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of that it's like this idea that that we're going to live forever, in but not in the eternal sense,
Right.
That's and that's the thing that I think that I kind of have the problem with. But I mean, again, I guess, while you are, I think, spot on to say that, as we point a finger at Hollywood, we need to realize that we have several fingers pointing back,
Sure.
and that, if we want uh, to have better films, then we do need to demand those things. But I guess, like, my only thing that I would say is that, like, you are an actor who, and Kevin as well, you're both actors, and then work with other actors that have essentially made up their mind that they're not going to, take roles and do films um that don't will for the good of the other, that don't elevate
Sure. Right.
the spirit and stuff like that. Um, and I guess it's just kind of like my hope, though it's probably naive, that one or both of those situations happens. I do think, that people. I do think that if they have the material presented in front of them, if they have a truly great film put in front of them, um, then they will watch it. And then, at least if for the briefest of moments, we have some hope that they're going to redirect their lives.
Yeah.
Um, but whether that's going to happen or not, I have no idea, because I just, like, from my standpoint, like, there's just a lot of stuff, you know that, it's almost like there's just darkness for the sake of darkness. Like, that was like, I tried, my wife, she was a funeral director and she's a scientist, so, like, she's super interested in serial killers, like everybody is. And
Right.
they had the Jeffrey Dahmer series that was on Netflix, and I couldn't watch it because
Hmm.
it was just disturbing for the sake of it being disturbing. And it's
Sure.
like, I don't know if that's necessarily oriented properly, because, like, well, now it's almost kind of like you're giving some dark praise to this very clearly fallen individual.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
You can't glorify it. That's the thing.
and that's kind of like where I'm, you know, that's kind of where I am with stuff. So I mean, like, my wife and I, we definitely shield ourselves from,
Sure.
from watching a lot of that stuff that's out there. But, I guess it's just my hope that one or the other happens, or both. That, someone in Hollywood, which I think you do see the glimmerings of that with things like The Chosen and with the Nefarious movie and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Uh, hopefully that's going to reorient us, and put us on the right path again. But I guess, as a good segue to that, uh, is to discuss the Lord of the Rings, which I think
Yeah.
is one of those moments in time that, it really, really, we got it right, and we brought all of those things together, as far as, like, you know um, well, I mean, you were talking about, like, with, the Ninja Turtles and stuff like that, where,
Yeah.
you know there was a craft that was, involved in all of this with the Lord of the Rings, and, telling Tolkien's story, not Peter Jackson's version of Tolkien's story. And, which, I mean, there are aspects of Peter Jackson that seep in there, but at least at the core of it, the kind of the unifying thing that I saw from the Weta Workshop, and I've heard Peter Jackson say it and his
Yeah.
writers say it, that we wanted to tell this story that Tolkien had to an audience that may not read the books and things along those lines.
Right.
But in any case, so, what was your sense of the movies? Like, what did you think that they got right, and what did you think that they got wrong? And then I've also got some
Mm.
follow up questions there as well.
Gosh. So this really should be a discussion. I don't want to make this too much of monologuing here, because that's what, to me, one of the fun things, in particular, about these films for people who are fans,
Yeah.
is making comments back and forth about it, and then, you know, kind of getting our temperatures of where we're at. I think you and I probably have a good sense of where each other are at with this, but yeah. Anyway, um, so for me, a big part of it has been that I saw the movies when they were in the theaters, and then have seen them many, many, many times after. So my journey with the films began, one, before I was Catholic, and two, what was the first one? 99, 2000. So, um, being in a point in my life where I was still pretty young, my initial thought with the films, I think I only had one critique. And I remember after having seen Return of the King, after finally all three of them had come out, was, and they didn't have another choice really, but the sort of multiple endings that they had to try and wrap up at the end of the film. And so you've got the end of the war in front of the Black Gate, right? And then they completely skip the fields of Crom Island because they just didn't have time. You end up with the end scene where Aragorn is crowned. And then in addition to that, after that, they do, which I thought was fairly clever, they travel over the map itself to go from Gondor back to the Shire, and sort of retrace the Hobbits' steps for the long journey that they've taken, that they're now going back. The one critique I think I have, and again, it was difficult for them to, it would have been really difficult to put this into the film. We didn't get the Scouring of the Shire. And with the way the film had been structured, I think that, and I say the film because I really do think of it as a single film, like, you know, even though it was three. Um, there's a great line when Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin are sitting in the tavern and Rosie's washing the glasses, and it's right before Sam gets up the courage to go ask her to marry him. And there's a narration, it's voiceover, and Frodo says, "How do you go back?" And the thing that was impactful about the way that they chose to do the end of the film was that here they are having had all the experiences that they'd had, and the Shire essentially remained unchanged, and that nobody in the Shire could have had any sense of what they went through. They were never ever going to be able to be the people that they had been before. And I think that the way Peter Jackson chose to do the end of the film for the way that the rest of the film had been done was probably the only way you could do it. I think the Scouring of the Shire is an extremely important part of the story. But for the films, even though I was sad they didn't have it in there, I think that the end of the movie really was done the only way you could do it, and that was emphasizing the distance between the experiences of the four hobbits and the rest of the Shire, um, and them knowing that there was something that would forever set them apart from and no longer make them the members of that community that they had once been. They were different, and it was irrevocable. So I think that that part was pretty much the only way you could have done it. And then him having done it that way, he did it well. But I think that it would have been, obviously, I missed the fact that the Scouring of the Shire was not in there. In terms of the film and the essence of the film, because there are a lot of things about the films that when I got older and I rewatched them and recognized aspects of the book that I hadn't really been sensitive to before, there are a great many things about the films that I thought, man, it probably would have been impossible to do, but they did miss some opportunities in a lot of places in terms of what Tolkien, I think Tolkien's, um, the essence of what it is he was trying to communicate in this struggle and these various things. But the things that they got right were many and most. I think that we talk about craft. That film has so many amazing, had so many amazing craftspeople working on it. Everybody from the costume designers to, and we talked about this a little bit before too, the smiths who were hand linking chainmail, to the horse trainers who were teaching the actors to ride the horses, to the characters, or I'm sorry, the actors who literally learned how to sword fight with broadswords and two-handed and one-handed swords and all the rest of it. The craftsmanship that went into that film made that film Middle Earth. That's the thing that I think I can say about it overall. When I watch those films, I am utterly immersed in Middle Earth. A couple of the things that are super geeky about it, but that I think are just really phenomenal, was when Peter Jackson was trying to decide on the look of the films. They wanted to shoot everything more or less what's referred to in the production industry as flat. They didn't want any kind of color grade or any kind of look applied to the films prior to getting them into post production. And then his process for how he created the look of Middle Earth to make it look like it was a place like Earth and also not like Earth at the same time. They did a color grade for what they thought it should look like. Like, what would it look like? What color would the grass be? What color would the skin tones be? What colors would the trees be? All these different things. And then once they got it to where it actually looked like what everyone thought, okay, that's what it would look like in terms of if this was Earth, if it was reality. Tolkien or Peter Jackson then said, now let's apply a look to it that makes us feel like we're a quarter of a turn off of the earth. I don't want it to be I don't want the grass to be bright orange. I don't want for trees to have, fruit we've never seen growing off of them. I want it to be so subtly different that it's almost only subconscious that you find that your immersion in the world um, is almost you give it permission without knowing that you're giving it permission. And the subtlety of those aspects of the filmmaking, um, the fact that they pioneered some filmmaking techniques in terms of how they shot the characters who were supposed to be standard size and the characters who were supposed to be smaller in the same scenes. New technologies in terms of how they achieve forced perspective and how, for the first time, they were able to achieve camera movements during scenes where there was forced perspective. All of these different things that they did. That film series, that franchise, is truly a work of craftsmen and women. Like, it really is. And so when it comes to the Lord of the Rings, this is my 50,000 foot view here. Um, you are immersed in Middle Earth, and it is craftsmanship at its highest level.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that that's kind of the thing that it allows you to be able to forgive some of the what would be mortal sins. Of
Right.
this, but it's like, like I hate what they did to the character Faramir.
Me too.
And I just
Yes.
did a whole podcast episode on that. Talking about where they got Faramir wrong, and where it and how um, as a man, if you want to emulate a great character, it would be a Faramir like character. And
Absolutely.
to see them kind of screw that up in what made it to the big screen
Hmm.
wasn't the best, though they did fix a little bit of it when they released the extended edition, and then you're like, okay,
Yeah.
like there was that intent, although they still did, like the scene with Frodo, Faramir, Sam, the Ring, and Gollum, like they still
Hmm.
got the character Faramir quite wrong, I would say.
Yeah.
And just didn't portray him. They didn't give him the correct arc, and
Yeah.
didn't orient him properly, because Faramir is oriented properly. Like he should have been clearly contrasted from his brother and
His
from
brother.
and he you do get that, but not to the degree that it should have been gotten. But I think that the films, in and of themselves, when compared to a lot of Hollywood films, like we had talked about this before we agreed to do this podcast with one another, but the women that were in the movies,
Hmm.
um, were just that, like, that was the beauty of women properly oriented in such
Hmm.
a way to where it was just like, like when I don't think I've tried to explain this to my wife that it's just like, yeah, like there are times like when like the way that, like Galadriel is like, gleaming and like that's the way that I view you sometimes. Like that's like
Right.
how much I love you and like how much of the good in me, like that's how much good I see in you. Um and that it's like, my desire for my wife is properly oriented as a result of the goodness that I see in her beauty, and I think that
Mm.
and I think that that those films they got a lot right that they could have, like they could have tried to make they could have tried to make Eowyn and Luthien, or not Luthien, Arwen
Arwen, yeah. Mhm.
and Galadriel. They could have tried to have made them, like sexy, like Megan Fox type
Right.
of deal. So the fact that they didn't do that because they knew that that's clearly not what Tolkien was trying to do,
Right.
um, was, I think, really, really good. And I think that like we had talked, or I had said this, that I think, one of my favorite scenes in the films is when, just from the standpoint of it being a beautiful shot, is when Eowyn goes out of Edoras, and the wind is just blowing her hair and her dress, and she's a stunning beauty. But
She is.
it's like, but if you were to look at her and be like, "That's hot," it'd be like you're kind of a sicko. It's like, like if you're that guy in the movie theater at that scene, it's like you got some screws
Yes.
loose, buddy. Like,
That's right. That's
and the
right.
same thing when you see like Aragorn and Arwen in the garden. Like that's one of
Yes.
the most beautiful scenes of a man and a woman ever caught on camera, I think. And
That's
it was,
beautiful.
yeah, and it orients you properly. So I mean, like there were so many good things about the films that
There were.
it does make, again, like as a younger person, like you said that when you walked out of the theaters, you were like, ah, I wish they would have put the Scouring of the Shire in there. But the fact that, a young person that doesn't know as much looked at that, and it, like, left you halfway oriented properly, to where at least
That's
you
right.
at least renewed an interest in those books and got people reading them and talking about them and
Mhm.
maybe improving your life ever so slightly. It's like that's a net gain, and I think that that the great lesson for Hollywood to learn from that is that, um, you know they were a smashing success. Like they
They
won
were.
every award and they made a ton of money. So it's like, I think, yeah, everyone, and they continued. I mean, it's the perfect example of a cup overflowing. I mean, it's just like anything Lord of the Rings. It's a guaranteed audience.
It is, yeah.
Even if you don't like the new stuff that they're doing, people are still watching it. I mean, like
They
uh,
certainly are.
my brother, he hates the Rings of Power. Can't stand it. I have not personally seen it because I don't think I'm going to like it. So I tend to just
Yeah.
steer away from stuff like that. And I don't want to get into criticizing, because it's not what I want to do. But even still, my brother watched like every episode, and I like he would come every time he'd see me, he would like stomp over and he'd be like, "Did you see the new?" And I was just like, "No, I know I'm not gonna be happy, so why would I?"
Why would I do
Like
it?
like
Right.
Aristotle says that people are happiest when they're acting according to reason. I know that I'm probably not going to like this too terribly much, so why would I
Why
go
would I
and
do it? That's right.
forcibly make myself unhappy? Um,
Oh.
but yeah, I mean, I think that there's a great lesson to be learned there. Uh,
Mhm.
by everyone, us and Hollywood. That it's like, you know, those films hit home with a lot of people, and
They did.
I can definitely tell you, I mean, my kids when th're growing up, like I fantasize about this idea of being able to read my children at the age of one, The Hobbit, and
You're gonna start them early. That's good.
indoctrinating them to be the next generation of Tolkien fans. But and
That's a
those
good
films
idea.
definitely had that impact on me. So, is there anything else you'd like to mention with regard to the films, or?
Um, when one of the things that was really neat about the films, and there was a lot. I mean, I particularly as a younger person, before having more ability to understand the deeper things of the books, those films and the books, previously the books, they touch that thing in me. And this is, I think, interesting because this happens at different levels. I was telling you before that there's always been this sense of like seeing the transcendent in things, right? Particularly in stories. And I remember the friend of mine, awesome guy named John Scott, who introduced me to the books in the first place. Um, I remember after reading The Hobbit and then reading the trilogy, and I thought, what is it about this? It's like, and I remember trying to come up with a word, and I was like, it's like reality, but it's a fantasy story. Like I couldn't wrap my head around why it felt so real. And it was it was before, and I had no idea at the time that Tolkien was a man of faith. Like I didn't know that at the time. But this speaks to the aspect of creators that we were talking about earlier, and creators of faith. I recognized in those books, and I also recognized it in the films, because I think Peter Jackson's aim, and this goes back to also what we talked about earlier, that the person is meant to serve the story. I think that Peter Jackson's aim was to do everything he could to make something that was in essence true to what, as he said, Professor Tolkien had written. And in watching those films and recognizing there was something about them and about the books that pointed to something higher, it made me start to recognize what art was really capable of. And it was also at the time that I saw the films, almost nobody else I knew at that time had either read The Lord of the Rings or was really that interested in seeing the movies, because it was elves and dwarves, and they were, and they were fighting dragons and cave trolls, and it was everybody looked at this as this sort of, or many people looked at this as this sort of um, escapist Dungeons and Dragons
Right.
kind of content. And I remember at the time, something I liked about it was I actually experienced persecution from a friend of mine who was a guy I went to church with, and he said, "Oh yeah, guess what? Last weekend we went and saw your Lord of the Rings movies."
Oh, well, there's some Professor Nuance there, eh?
That's exactly right. And at first I was kind of like, you don't know what like I was thinking this. I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. They're great and blah blah blah. And your mom goes to college. And so I was but then after a while I was like, no, that's kind of cool, because something in me knows that there's something deeper about those stories than what his experience was. And we as creators who are also people of faith have the benefit in the gifts that we've been given artistically to tap into the greatest source of creativity that exists. That is the Trinity.
Yeah.
What we make, not because of us, but because of where it comes from, should be akin to those films, in the sense that Tolkien was creating from that place. He was creating from the place of being inspired and was with this incarnational creative experience because of what was flowing through him. That's to me one of the most beautiful things about those films is that Peter Jackson, in a desire to serve that story, in a way, it was you talked about an incremental turn toward betterment, of toward correct orientation. He did that even if he didn't know it.
Yeah.
There was a submission on his part to a greater story, and he gave himself to it. He gave himself completely to it. I mean, if you watch the behind the scenes stuff, that man lived those movies for over 4 years. I mean, it was just, all that he did. And that's some a lesson that we should take from those films, and probably the thing that fills me with the greatest joy in watching them is that what we're seeing is the result of a man, J.R.R. Tolkien, who gave himself up to the greatest source of inspiration that any of us as creators could ever hope to have. Um, Tolkien, G.K. Chesterton, Shakespeare. You look at the people who tapped into that level of creativity, and you look at the works that they produced. If if creators who were people of faith were allowing the medium to be so in awe of the message that they worked as hard on that part of their craft as they did on getting the message out there, we would see more of those experiences where people are being correctly oriented by the art, because it would be a channel for the spirit of God.
Well, and that's, I mean, like really, and just a lot of beautiful imagery with what you just brought up there. But that's essentially what I'm trying to do with my life and with my work. And I'm assuming that's what you're trying to do with
There it
yours.
is. That's right.
It's, you know, um, like the image that I had pop into my head that it's like I wish that I had some talent as a painter or an artist, but it's like J.R.R. Tolkien finishing you know, the Lord of the Rings or any of his works, and just like holding it up to God, because
That's
that's
beautiful.
what it is that he's a steward to what God gave him, which was this incredible amount of talent with regard to the creation of languages and the creation of
Language.
worlds and the creation um, of uh, um, this transcendent experience that he gives to us. And there's a beauty to that, and really, in much the same way, when I finish a piece of furniture, it's always trying to lift this up to God. Of like, it's a very very humble thing that I've done, but I think that I've done it in a way that's properly oriented, and it's not done to stroke my own ego,
Right.
and to bring about his glory. And I think that's in the sum of all things, if you get known for that, then that's a pretty great thing to be known for. So yeah, I love those books, and I love that we were able to talk about the books and the setting that we were able to talk about it. I mean, we definitely I mean, all all of the people that we were with, it was brilliant to listen to all.
Oh my gosh, it was so great. Yeah.
But I mean, it definitely definitely left an impact on me that I hope that we're able to get everything figured out to continue on with Silmarillion and all that good stuff. 'Cause that's
Me too, man. Me too.
but it is definitely getting late, and I have taken
Woo!
up entirely too much of your time. David, thank you for blessing me with your time, and thank you to the audience that tunes in to this episode of the First Aid Woodworking Podcast. So thank you all for your time. God bless. Thank you for tuning into this podcast. I hope that you'll like, subscribe, and share this information along with people who may be interested in it. God bless.